Welcome, everyone. I'm your moderator, John Yuva, editor for Food Logistics. Thank you for joining today's web seminar titled North Korea, the Supply Chain Perspective on What to Expect and What to Do, sponsored by Resilinc, the leading cloud and mobile provider of supply chain resilience and supply chain risk management intelligence and analytics. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using your On24 control panel. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A portion of our event. The speakers have agreed to make slides available after the presentation. Resilinc will be publishing a detailed white paper about their analyses and recommendations in the next few days. Attendees who are interested in the white paper should check Resilinc's website, www.resilinc.com. Let's meet our presenters for today. Bob Kyle is a partner with Hogan Lovells. Bob served in senior positions in the White House and Congress, as well as the National Security Council, and has since participated in many meetings in the White House Situation Room. He was a senior official at the Office of Management and Budget, where he oversaw a defense and intelligence budget of more than $300 million. Bob is well positioned to comment on U.S. sanctions, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, export controls, taxes, energy policy, budget issues, trade restrictions, and trade agreements policy. He manages issues involving regulatory compliance, government advocacy, outreach to foreign embassies and foreign governments, crisis management, and corporate strategy. Bindya Vakil is CEO and founder of Resilinc. Bindya is a recognized thought leader in the area of supply chain risk management. She also founded the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Council, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the discipline of supply chain risk management, and was recently awarded a patent for evaluating and presenting the supply chain vulnerability and risk of an enterprise. Without further ado, I'll turn the event over to Bindya.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for attending. We are very pleased to present our analysis and assessment on the North Korea geopolitical situation today. We're very excited to have Bob with all of his expertise in having sat in many situation room briefings, where we believe Bob can give us a very nice and unique perspective on what goes on, what people are thinking. And this insight from him was instrumental as we were thinking about the various scenarios that we need to consider as we look at supply chain and the impacts potentially of the dynamics that are taking place in the North Korea situation. So without further ado, Bob, I would love for you to talk about your observations as it sets the context for what's going on in North Korea right now.
Sure. Thanks, Bindya. First of all, it's really great to be here with John and Bindya, and thanks to Resilinc for setting this up. This is really an important subject. You know, when Obama met with incoming President Trump during the transition, he told him that North Korea is the most dangerous and difficult security challenge you will face, and I think subsequent events have only proven that out. Let me begin by making three overview observations about why this problem is so difficult and why risk management in this area is so important. And the first overview observation I had is that all the options here are highly flawed. They're all lousy. Most decisions that come before the president, whether it's in the Situation Room or else otherwise in the Oval Office, involve lousy options. Because if there was an easy option, a clearly attractive option, the bureaucracy would have decided that option long ago and decided to pursue it. Only the most difficult and intractable issues come up to the president. That's why the job is so hard. And of all the ones that I've ever seen, North Korea has to be right near the top in terms of the lousy options. I mean, if you look at, and that explains why this is so intractable and why the risk is so great. You know, if you think about the different options that are out there, the first is sort of a military option. And what we'll see is most of those involve unacceptable casualties. Second one you'd look at is a negotiated settlement. Sounds much more diplomatic and safe. But Clinton, Bush, and Obama all tried the diplomatic route and either found they couldn't reach an agreement that worked for the United States or that North Korea broke the agreement that they'd entered. So that's not a very attractive option. The third one you might say is, well, what about economic sanctions? But in that, China's really critical to North Korea. As we're going to see, China accounts for 90% of the trade in North Korea, so it's hard to really apply and leverage unless China gets more serious about putting pressure on North Korea, and that has not been the case. So that option is highly flawed. And then you get to more dark options like regime change. And there you have U.S. law restrictions. You have to ask if you got rid of the current leader, what would follow, and all those things. So all of those options really are highly flawed, and it makes the issue highly intractable, and therefore it leads to frustration. And particularly for a new president who comes in and finds this intractable, difficult, frustrating situation, they may have a tendency to move to nonsensible alternatives. And that's one of the risks we're seeing. The second overview observation I'd simply make is that the two leaders here create an irreducible uncertainty which creates risk in this situation. You have Kim Jong-un, who's very determined to develop nuclear capability, and he's a strong man. He can make his country do it, even if he sacrifices their economy and the benefits of his people. And then you have President Trump, who I think it's fair to say in a balanced fashion is mercurial. And the tweet that he sent regarding a negotiated settlement with North Korea over the weekend, that Tillerson's wasting his time trying to get a deal because we'll take care of it another way, makes it really difficult for Tillerson to go to either the North Koreans or the Chinese and say, let's work out a diplomatic solution. So through a series of tweets, you've created problems that way. And then the third general observation I'd suggest is that the uncertainty is likely to persist. The history of North Korea is that you find temporary solutions and they may ease tensions for a bit, but that this problem continues. And unless there is an option that develops here that really provides some kind of fundamental solution to this thing, you may find, as you're thinking about this for your business, that uncertainty will persist for some period of time with waves going up and down in terms of level uncertainty, but the problem remains. So with that, let me turn it over to Bindia.
Thanks, Bob. So given all options allow the options in this case, and we very much agree, even from a supply chain perspective, there are, it seems, no good options here. So, having said that, supply chain practitioners, we like to be prepared, and we like to plan a response. And so what we felt was important today was to give our experts a few different scenarios so that we can assume certain things would happen and then make our supply chain response and playbook in line with those scenarios. Since there are so many different things, this is obviously a dynamic and moving situation, evolving situation. There are players, and depending on one player and what they say or do and how the other responds, many different things can happen, and there are many different ways this could play out. So in the conversations Bob and I had over the last couple of weeks was, what was a valid scenario? We needed to figure out the right criteria. And what we came up with was, we would be concerned, obviously, because the risk is there, because there's a likelihood of something happening, which is fairly high, meaning it's medium to high likelihood, and that would make it a scenario that we would include in our list. And the second would be that, we should be aware because the impact is severe. So those were the two things. The likelihood was high, even if the impact wasn't severe, or the likelihood was low to medium, but the impact could be severe, and so that created a high degree of risk that made us include those scenarios in our list. So with that, we'll go through one by one each of the scenarios, and really, the current state, it's a war of words. That's what we will talk about first. We'll go into trade sanctions, how a U.S. versus China trade sanctions situation might play out. And then we have a few military option-related scenarios where, whether it's a deliberate or an accidental attack on Japan or a deliberate action against South Korea versus the U.S. taking some preemptive action against North Korea or North Korea, given the reach of their global, missiles now, them taking a preemptive action against U.S. interests in the Pacific. So those are some of our scenarios. The way we will run this is I will just quickly talk about a scenario. Bob will introduce kind of the geopolitical considerations and dynamics in each case. And then I will talk about the supply chain impact if that happens. So with that, we'll talk about just currently, Bob, what's going on right now in the world with how you said it. There's tweet storms going on. There's people from the North Korea side responding. So help us unravel what's going on here and understand.
Sure. So, I think that, first of all, this scenario envisions really that it's a war of words only. Needless to say, and what many people are worried about, is that a war of words can precipitate actions, particularly military actions, and cause problems. But so that we have scenarios that have some, intellectual content to it, we're assuming here that it just starts and ends, really, as a war of words. And what you're seeing right now, obviously, is either, depending on if you see this as a very conscious strategy by the Trump administration, there would appear to be some good cop, bad cop going on, with Trump playing the bad cop and Tillerson playing the good cop, or you see it as an uncoordinated strategy where the president, as I mentioned over the weekend, seemed to undercut his Secretary of State's diplomatic initiatives. And people could have different views as to what that is, but at this point, of course, we're in a war of words. And to the extent it stays a war of words, Bindya will go through, what the economic ramifications of it are. I think, it's going to depend on what words are said and what happens. But one thing I would point out is that war of words can create uncertainty of itself, and companies worried about that uncertainty may start to take real actions that have economic consequences. And so you need to think about that. I think the other thing is a war of words that involves China could begin to have ramifications on the U.S.-China relationship. And does that have, again, real-world ramifications in terms of economics, in terms of cooperation on global issues, and so forth? Even words can start to have some impact there, even if it doesn't lead to a military confrontation. So those can be problems. And I think we're going to see more of this, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. But obviously, words alone is one of the better case scenarios that you can envision here. Why don't I turn it back over to Bindya then?
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that dynamic come to play here, Bob, because as you said, uncertainty creates the war of words creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is why we're all here today worried about this scenario or this situation and talking about how can businesses prepare. And, you see this, governments are preparing, right? I mean, we see Japan, South Korea in recent weeks and months talking about or actively boosting their defensive capabilities. The president talking about America first and defending America first, and companies and countries feel the need to invest in their own risk management and their own resilience. So obviously, that generates demand of some kind all the way down the supply chain, whether you're buying more defense equipment, aerospace equipment, that there's a lot of suppliers and sub-tier suppliers who are all seeing some of the uncertainty-driven additional demand. And so, from the supply chain perspective, purely speaking, the status quo, while extremely nerve-wracking and completely fraught with uncertainty, is the best case of all of the scenarios that we're considering today. And some industries, some companies will actually benefit. And at the very least, we don't see a major disruption, at least driven by this particular situation, if status quo remains. Of course, supply chains are, also struggling with a lot of the aftermath of the hurricanes, and there are other issues. But certainly, if status quo remains, at least this is, one situation which will allow us to do other things. So with that, Bob, perhaps you can talk about the next one, which is of interest to all of us and worries us, which is the trade restrictions and the messaging coming from the administration on that.
Yeah, so the key with regard to trade restrictions that could affect North Korea is really China, because China accounts for 90% of the trade, of North Korea's trade. And so it's really the critical player. As far as U.S. companies are concerned, many of you may know that the United States has imposed essentially a total embargo, investment and trade embargo, with regard to U.S. companies operating in North Korea or interacting with North Korea. And so that's really not that much of an issue, because that sanction has already been imposed just about as fully as it could be. So we really look at China. And in this area, what we're talking about probably is the United States trying to put additional pressure on China to get it, in turn, to put greater pressure on North Korea with regard to denuclearization. And in this regard, I want to spend a second talking about different types of trade sanctions that we have. One is the type you may be most used to, is sort of the traditional trade war, where suppose we, the United States, have an issue with China and feel like they're not giving sufficient copyright protection to our companies. And so we block some imports from China into the United States. And China retaliates and it blocks us. That's sort of your more traditional trade war situation. The situation we're in is a different type of situation, and that has to do with foreign policy sanctions. In this case, what's happened over the last decade or so is that the United States has become much more robust at saying to companies from other countries, if you do business with the country we want to sanction, whether it's Iran or Sudan or North Korea or whatever, we will prevent you, the company that does that business, from having access to the U.S. market. And the way they usually do that is cut off their access to correspondent financial banks, which cuts them off from the U.S. financial system, which means you can't trade in dollars. And then companies say, well, in a choice between, say, North Korea and the United States, I guess I'll choose the United States market. It's much bigger. It's much more lucrative. This is what the Trump administration just started to do last week when it issued an executive order. It gave the Secretary of the Treasury the right to sanction companies that do business with North Korea, and the sanction would be that they would be cut off from the U.S. financial market. And that is a new departure, a new step that hadn't been taken before. The frustration is that you could talk to China about having their companies halt business with North Korea, but it sort of wasn't working. So now we have to take the extra step of imposing extraterritorial, or as they call it in the sanctions world, secondary sanctions on Chinese companies and on any other company from any other country that does it as well. And so this is a new departure that the United States is just beginning to undertake. They only named a few entities, but potentially the Secretary of Treasury could name most Chinese entities if he wanted to. He has that authority now. And so one question that comes up with regard to trade restrictions is the Trump administration going to use this new authority bullishly and really try to bludgeon Chinese companies to make sure they don't do business with North Korea? And if they do, how will the Chinese government react to that? In the past, in the traditional trade wars, the Chinese government has been very glad to fight back and push back and counter-retaliate, and it led to a more traditional trade war. So does that happen here? Or is the Chinese government perhaps quietly happy that the U.S. government is forcing Chinese companies to do things that the Chinese government would rather not tell its own companies to do, and it's going to allow this to happen? Can the U.S. ratchet this up slowly enough that it works successfully and doesn't create a negative and counterproductive reaction from the Chinese government? Or will they step over the line and the Chinese government will react? That is all out there, still to be determined. But the point I wanted to make is that last week, for the first time, a U.S. administration stepped over that line of these secondary sanctions that could affect Chinese companies, not necessarily even in a targeted fashion. And therefore, this starts us down a new road, and that's an area where I think if you were going to have trade restrictions coming out of this, that's the kind of thing you'd find. The UN has obviously imposed also some additional trade restrictions on North Korea, but they were not viewed as aggressive as this potential tool by the United States. So with that, let me pause and turn it over to Bindia.
So yeah, that's very interesting. That can go down in so many different ways, right, Bob, because of the extensive amounts of trade that we do with Chinese companies, and the fact that obviously, as you saw from the previous slide, most of China's trade happens, most of North Korea's trade actually happens with China. So, this is where, without the specific information, what happens now is you can see that the macroeconomic trade statistics fail us because we don't really understand, how sanctions could hit, how they might have an impact, and how an individual company might be impacted by that. So in the high-tech industry, for example, we have so many component suppliers, and actually same for the auto or industrial or heavy or other industries. So many of our component suppliers, sub-assembly suppliers are based in China. But in many cases, these materials don't come to the U.S. directly. They go to other countries for further assembly, etc., before coming here. So will those be affected or not? So, this is where a proper mapping of the supply chain becomes really critical. And certainly if you have, your supply chain mapped out, which companies are in your supply chain, meaning, your sub-tier supply chain, because a lot of times, we find in the supply chain world, companies are very, very good at knowing their tier one suppliers, where they're located, what they're, who they're doing business with, etc. But they get very blindsided when it comes to the second-tier suppliers. And these second-tier suppliers may be single-sourced, constrained suppliers based in China, potentially doing some business with, countries that may be on a restricted list. And so you may not realize that you may have a problem supplier in your sub-tier supply chain. So, importing products directly from China, who your suppliers are, and you can easily map the impact to your business there. However, if you haven't done multi-tier mapping of your suppliers and your sub-tier suppliers, then you will require more time and effort. I mean, in the Resilinc customer world, this is what we do, and we map our customers, suppliers, and their sub-tier suppliers, where they're located, where their factories are located, because we can, if you have a factory of your supplier located in China, then that there's a chance that there's, either they're buying material from someone who may be a problem supplier, or they themselves may be doing business with North Korea for certain types of commodities. So again, mapping the supply chain, knowing the sub-tier suppliers, especially for the specialized constrained capacity type of material, is absolutely critical. Now, therefore, if you're a Resilinc customer, just go to your What If or your China tab and pull up the supplier names and just, talk to these suppliers where you're sole sourced or single sourced, and make sure that, you've done your diligence about their business practices. If you haven't, if you have identified these suppliers, find out from the Resilinc system, you'll be able to see, do they have a redundant manufacturing capability in a different place or country? Have they qualified alternate sites? And then the best strategy there is, if the alternate site is available, you could book a capacity option or grab, enough sufficient inventory to cover the time it takes the supplier to bring up the alternate site. So there are things you can do for the suppliers where the information on supply chain mapping is quickly available. And then the other thing is, check if your route touches a risky area, and then is there a way that a 3PL can reroute shipments so you don't, your country of origin is not China, or the shipper is not a company that might be on a risky list. One thing here is, given that this is somewhat hypothetical, the situation, and we don't know how sanctions or what have you might actually play out, sometimes it is very difficult to proactively justify the business expense of acting preemptively. So in this case, look at the revenue impact. So this is a great way to convince your business if you are worried about a supplier and you feel like you need to do something. Check what would happen if the supply of that part, raw material, component, or if that supplier were to be disrupted, and evaluate how much of your revenue is dependent on that. And that will give you, if you're spending $200,000, $300,000, but that material or part impacts $1 billion worth of your revenue, often your leadership will look at it and say, what, let's just act preemptively and protect ourselves. So again, mapping the supply chain, if you have not already done so, would really help you to manage your playbook for this scenario without actually spending money on a wide range of activities like second sourcing or trying to hold inventory across a wide swathe of parts or products, because that is, as we know, not cost effective. So with that, let's go to, we've talked about the more peaceful scenarios. I think the next couple of scenarios are more of the, attack and military option types of scenarios. So Bob, could you help us think through this one, for instance?
Sure. So let's talk, first of all, about sort of all of the military scenarios, because we have a couple coming up, and let's think about those a little bit collectively, and then I'll talk specifically about scenario 3 where South Korea is under attack. So with regard to all those military scenarios, I think one of the things I want to caution is that we not see these as separate boxes, but rather layered and potentially interacting. So for example, if North Korea attacks Guam, that's probably not the end of the story. The United States would almost certainly respond in some way. And so these are related. I think for purposes of clarity, we've created different scenarios, because I think that is the right way to try to organize your mind around this, but we should just understand that these scenarios obviously are all interacting and can layer on top of each other as things go along. The second point I'd make about all the scenarios is, don't think of this as all or nothing necessarily. The press has a tendency to say what's going to happen is North Korea will be obliterated or Seoul will be obliterated. But I think people who are gaming this out at the Pentagon and the Situation Room, wherever it is, will also look at more partial scenarios. So, for example, you can have scenarios with unintended results rather than a conscious premeditated attack. One of the scenarios we're going to look at is Japan and the possibility for attack there. But suppose, for example, that North Korea flies a test missile over Japanese territory, and the intent is to have the missile land harmlessly in the water, but instead something goes wrong accidentally, and the missile lands on Japanese territory. That's probably a different scenario from a military standpoint than a premeditated attack right on Seoul by North Korea. And how does the international community, the United States included, react to that? And so I think as you're thinking about scenarios here, we need to understand it's not all or nothing. The press likes to ramp it up that way, but I think we need to think in a more nuanced way, recognizing that the all or nothing scenarios are real scenarios and they could happen, but we need to think about the others as well. The third point that I wanted to make really is what happens after the military scenario. We tend to sort of assume Seoul will be attacked. That's sort of as far as our analysis goes, but maybe we ought to think about, how does China react to that? What do they do? What are the counter reactions? What's the length and duration of any reconstruction? How long does that take? How long is your supply chain disrupted? What do you have to do? And what happens to U.S.-China relations in the middle of some of these military scenarios? What other secondary and tertiary effects grow out of that? And the press, again, tends to sort of see the military attack, and then somehow that's the end of the story. As we saw in Iraq, the invasion was, from a military sense, successful. But then there was a long story of what happened after that. And so I think we need to think about that, too, as you think about all of the risks that you could face. So with that, let me turn specifically to Scenario 3, the South Korea under attack scenario. And I think the thing that's important to note here, obviously there's a wide variety of attacks that could occur and the nature of the attack, but North Korea does have the capability, according to most intelligence estimates, to do significant damage to Seoul. There's a lot of declassified material that you can look at, that there's a capacity to do significant damage to Seoul. It may not obliterate it, a phrase that's frequently used, as much as some of the press has suggested and sensationalized it, but that's not to minimize the fact that there could be catastrophic damage through this kind of attack that could really make a big difference in Seoul and certainly other parts of South Korea. So with that, let me turn it over to Bindya to talk about the supply chain impacts of all of that.
Yeah, so as you see the quote from IDC, regardless of what type of an attack happens, a significant military attack or option with respect to South Korea will affect electronics production globally. And Resilinc's data definitely validates this prediction, as well as you will see in the next couple of slides. So, to set the initial context based on just the macroeconomic, South Korea, I think all of the people on this call certainly know it is the global hub of high-tech electronics, semiconductor device manufacturing. These little semiconductor complex chips, integrated chips, they're wafer fabbed, assembly tested, shipped all over the world to, electronic manufacturing facilities. Even, automotive finished product parts, automotive parts, accessories, all of these are major exports from South Korea. A lot of the consumer electronics that we use, either originates there or is significantly dependent on production from South Korea. So our prediction as well, based on the data that we have, is a significant attack or a military type of a scenario with respect to South Korea paints a very scary picture, at least if nothing else based on the macroeconomics. But a further look at what Resilinc supply chain mapping intelligence shows, it's even more alarming when you look at that. So let's take a look at this, which is the map that you are seeing. It shows you the global supplier site concentration based in South Korea. So Resilinc, as you know, many of you know, we are the supply chain mapping company. So we map global factory locations, warehouse, DCs, manufacturing sites, and those types of locations that are supply chain relevant. And so we have mapped tens of thousands of supplier factory locations worldwide. And in case of electronics manufacturing sites within range of traditional artillery within South Korea, there are thousands of these types of sites that are at risk. The map shows the proximity of these factories to the border with North Korea, over 200 sites within easy reach of Kaesong base, and another 1,300 sites within the high-risk zone if you have a coordinated attack. When we look at high-tech products and bill of material, we looked at over 1,500 products, and we saw the part origin where, there's almost every single product, and I'm talking between 90 to 100% of high-tech products here, where you have a tier 1 supplier site for a tier 2 supplier site based in South Korea. So Seoul and the Incheon areas of South Korea, these are very high value targets, and the world should be watching this and be very, very concerned. We will look at one more scenario, which is the Japan scenario, and then we will come back to this topic of why the high-tech and the semiconductor device industry in South Korea is really, we call it the backbone of global electronics manufacturing, and we consider these to be, the single points of failure for the electronics industry supply chain. So I'll let Bob pick up and talk us through the Japan scenario, and then we will really spend a little bit of time talking about that. Okay?
Sure.
Bob?
So glad to do it. Sure. So I think with Japan, obviously, very important economy. There is the possibility for a North Korean attack on Japan. I think that, in thinking about this, I would also think very heavily about what I sort of call the inadvertent scenario. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that most of the tests that have occurred in 2017 have been flying over Japan. The next slide shows this very clearly, as you can see. And the risk here, of course, when you do that, is that the intention by North Korea, presumably, is that these missile tests fly over Japan and then land harmlessly in the sea. But let's suppose something goes wrong and the missile craters, or the missile blows up, or the missile falls short and it lands in Japan. And so you accidentally have this problem. Then if you can imagine being a senior policymaker at the National Security Council, the Defense Department, what's your response? If you have intelligence that tells you that this was inadvertent rather than intentional, you may not decide to engage in overwhelming military response simply because it wasn't. You don't believe it was intentional. On the other hand, it's not nothing. And so what do? Do you have some military response with a very heightened diplomatic effort? What do? There's the possibility then if you respond in some type that they escalate and the whole thing escalates up, and you get to some of these other scenarios we're talking about, say where North Korea does attack Seoul and so forth. And so that's obviously a very touchy situation, but a real situation that could happen and may even be more likely than some of the intentional attack scenarios, depending on circumstances. And so as you understand your risk profile and what could happen, it's important to understand that as well. And I think that particularly comes up with this Japan scenario simply because of the trajectory of the tests that they've been undertaking in 2017. Let me turn it over to Bindia.
Yeah, and Japan has such a rich history of technology and advancement, innovation, and there's a huge amount of complex automated manufacturing that has a big hub and a lot of expertise in Japan. So very critical place in the high-tech auto, industrial, heavy, and advanced complex industry manufacturing supply chains. Rich history there. And so, an attack on Japan, and to Bob's point, doesn't have to be a deliberate attack, and a missile gone wrong would affect global supply chains across many industries. So I think, if you're a consumer electronics manufacturer and then your supply chain definitely is touching Japan, whether in the first tier or for sure in the second tier. Even if your direct suppliers aren't located in Japan, meaning you're like in a food or retail type of industry and you feel like your suppliers are all local or something. The reality is that manufacturing factories, use a lot of electronics, heavy type industrial machinery or consumables, adjacent products that they need in order to do the logistics and manufacturing and testing of your products and may be impacted by some turmoil in Japan. So, the likelihood of a deliberate attack may be low. An accidental attack could definitely occur if they continue down the path of, continuous and escalated missiles being tested with this trajectory. And also, if we look at the supply chain, if you look at the next slide, Resilinc has mapped 5,000 sites pretty much across Japan, So the trajectory that is selected has been kind of in that shaded area up north, which thankfully hasn't been the, high concentration zone for manufacturing. But you can see, all of Japan is really critical and very much at risk here, depending on the chosen path of these missiles and where, if things go wrong. So we see high-tech, auto, industrial, medical devices, semiconductor device components, sub-assemblies across the board are all at risk. When we looked at several thousand high-tech industry products, we see that almost in all of these, in fact, 95 to 100% of these products in this case has at least one part that comes from Japan directly or has a second-tier supplier part that comes from Japan. And so this is definitely, a scenario that should worry all of us. Now, let's take a look at the semiconductor supply chain, right? Why is this region so important to the world, and why should all of us really worry about what is going on in North Korea and how the situation could escalate or play out? One could almost say that in today's highly connected and highly virtual world, humanity and our very way of living is actually completely dependent on the continuous availability of the high-tech products that we're using in our lives at every stage. We carry our phone in our palm every waking minute. That's like an obvious one that we should worry about, but look at the products that touch our life. Look at the cars we drive, the medical devices, coffee machines, appliances, machines, trains, airplanes. Every product now has a display, and if it's got a display, there's a chip inside it. So, when you look at that, recently I heard that even shoes now have some chips that sync with your phone and your apps and tell you how many footsteps you've walked today. So there's, these parts and these materials, these highly complex, very nano-sized components coming from, these highly complex manufacturing sites based in Japan and South Korea both. So these chips, the innovation cycle follows Moore's law. Intel's Gordon Moore predicted back in 1965 that every year the number of transistors per square inch on an IC would double. So it's a simple statement, but this law has held true until about the last 5 years, and it has had tremendous implications on global electronics manufacturing capacity and capability. And it is one of the reasons why there are massive capacity constraints on IC manufacturing. And this is a highly precise, highly complex process. It begins in a very controlled, vibration, climate-sensitive, clean room environment. It's called a wafer fab. Hundreds of ICs are basically made on a thin slice of silicon, and then they're cut into chips. And these chips are then shipped to an assembly test facility where they're placed in the packaging that we see, which is a black box with pins sticking out that gets placed on an electronics board. Every 1 to 2 years, given that the Moore's law is applicable, we have to bring up smaller IC manufacturing lines online, and they not only have to be up, but we have to make millions of parts per week or per day. That kind of capacity has to be created because these ICs are used in high volume consumer electronics all over the place. So each fab, you can now see, each fab takes a couple of years to create, requires billions of dollars to manufacture, and then you have to redo the line every 1 to 2 years. So every fab that we have, every line that we have runs at 95% capacity. The chart that you're looking at shows where most of this capacity exists. So for people like us who look at supply chain data from our mapping intelligence for a living, the chart below is a very scary chart. By the way, this provides only a partial picture of the global supply chain, because if you looked at it and took it at face value, you might think that only the 37% of the wafer fab capacity that is based in Japan and South Korea would be impacted. But we look at supply chain mapping data, and we know that the parts that are actually wafer fabbed in Taiwan are very often then shipped to South Korea for assembly tests. And that means that, you know, almost 80% of the parts that are wafer fabricated in Taiwan are actually shipped to South Korea assembly test sites, which means that 50 or more % of IC capacity would be affected. You know, it's not just impact to South Korea wafer fabs and assembly test sites, but there's an indirect impact to Taiwan because of the wafer fab that would basically not have anyone, you know, available to do the processing. So our prediction, honestly, is that a world in which there is military action that affects South Korea and or Japan in a big way, pretty much life as we know it comes to an end for an extended period of time. You know, the innovation cycle itself, which has supported and scaled our growth, will be disrupted. And this affects our lives, our longevity on the planet. So let's look at really quickly the data that supports our prediction. So below is, now here what you're seeing is, you know, these are two charts for South Korean as well as Japanese wafer fabs, which shows that, you know, if there is a significant impact to wafer fab manufacturing facilities that requires the owner of the factory to do keep in mind, you know, these wafer fabs require clean room environments. This means very clean, no smoke damage, you know, no dust and those types of things. So this is a small disruption. Even a little bit of smoke can create a month-long disruption where you have to get all the soot out. No fire, you know, just soot could disrupt wafer fab manufacturing for a period of time. So what we hear from the suppliers who are based in Japan and South Korea, this is actual supplier-provided recovery time information. Given a worst-case scenario, they responded and said, how long would it take them to bring up pre-disruption run rate capacity? And you can see, you know, we've hidden the x-axis, which is the name of the supplier, and we're just showing you how many suppliers indicate, you know, more than 30 to 40 weeks of recovery time. I mean, this is a three quarters of the year where you're not going to get your necessary parts from your, you know, for your electronics, semiconductor electronics manufacturing suppliers. So you tell me, look at your business, look at your supply, look at your products, look at your suppliers, see what you're buying, and say, can you really hope to continue as a company if 3 quarters of the year, you know, worth of supply was wiped out? And remember, you can't ship a product if even one part is missing, right? So you can't ship a phone if one little thing on that phone is missing. So you could have everything available, but a few of these nano-sized devices could bring down your entire revenue for 3 quarters of a year. So recovery times are super long. You know, and this is one of the reasons why it is our belief and hope that military options are not realistically remaining on the table or not pursued, you know, no matter what the rhetoric may say. Let's hope that, you know, we're able to find negotiated peaceful settlement here. So with that, I'll let Bob talk through the next one, which is the U.S. does something on a preemptory basis. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Vidya. That was really a terrific analysis, I thought, on the semiconductor part of this. I learned a lot by listening to that. Thank you very much. So, you know, when we talk about a preemptive attack by the United States, I think most of us probably believe that doesn't sound very likely, and I think there's truth to that. I think the one thing we particularly need to think about in the context of this scenario is, suppose the United States believes that it or its allies are in imminent danger of a North Korean attack, and it's about to happen. In that context, the United States might not wait to let the attack happen before it acts. And so there are scenarios under which it's preemptive, but it's in response to what's viewed as pretty clear and present danger. I think regardless who attacks first, in a lot of ways, from the standpoint of the supply chain, I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference. If the United States attacks North Korea later or earlier, the military damage and so forth and the possibility for retaliation still exists. And therefore, this scenario is important to think about just because of the damage it could do, regardless how exactly it unfolds. I think if the United States were to attack North Korea, the betting generally is that the first actions would be to take out North Korea's launch infrastructure precisely so that it would limit the damage that it could do to South Korea or to Japan and targets of North Korea. So that would probably be the first step. And United States military capability is very precise and can be very precise with precision-guided missiles and so forth. But it is war. It can never be perfect. I think there's an expectation that it could take out a lot of North Korea's launch infrastructure. But the truth is, you never know if your intelligence is perfect until it's put to the test, and they probably think it's definitely not perfect. And so do you get everything? And can you stop a North Korean counterattack in some way, particularly given the proximity of Seoul and South Korea itself? And last, it's hard to know that you can destroy all the weapons versus the infrastructure, because weapons are smaller, they're mobile, much more mobile, and it's not clear that you can destroy all that, and that if any launch infrastructure or other infrastructure is still available, the weapons can still be used. So this is obviously a tragic, something's gone horribly wrong, but the United States presumably in this scenario felt it had to do it, but the consequences could be quite large here. So with that, let me turn it over to India to talk about supply chain effects.
Yeah, so I think, in really the supply chain effect of any kind of a preemptive effect is it basically look at scenario 3, 4, and 6. That's how I would characterize it, because once you enter a military option, that means there's a South Korea impact or a North Korea impact. A South Korea or Japan or North Korea response. So I think that would take us to the last scenario. And in the interest of time, Bob, maybe you could help us think through the last one. What is in the mind of, the leadership in North Korea, and how should we think about this?
I think with regard to a North Korean attack on U.S. bases, scenario number 6, is that what we're talking about? That's what you wanted me to address? Okay, so we'll move to slide 23. I think it's North Korea has probably stepped away from some of this, but who knows what they would do. It's a little bit unclear. I think, though, to the extent this scenario happens, I think we need to see it as a first step in a larger conflagration. It's hard to imagine that if North Korea attacks Guam, it's hard to believe that the United States would not respond in some military manner. And therefore, it goes back to the opening point I made, that these scenarios have to be seen as interconnected and layering on top of each other, because this scenario I see as the first step in a further military conflict that, may last long, may last short, depends on what's done diplomatically in connection with it. But this is really a first step that would lead to other things, is my guess.
Exactly, and I think from a supply chain perspective, as Bob said, no military option is a good option, and there's no option in the military conflict that leaves South Korean factories safe. So I think depending on how events play out, how long drawn out a conflict may last, we are saying that supply chain impact is likely to be high to all the way to severe or crippling. So with that, just to kind of summarize on the 6 scenarios we talked about, any military scenario is not a good scenario, right? That is kind of what our key walk away here is. And status quo, not ideal, but it is our best hope. A peaceful resolution is the most ideal situation. And I think the plan for supply chain practitioners and experts is prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Bob, any final thoughts before we go to, a quick final slide?
No, I'd be glad to do that and then take any questions and answers if people want to ask them.
Great. Okay, so the last thing is, there are lots of people asking, what can companies do to prepare? I made the point earlier, best-in-class companies today, they don't manage risk with inventory. They look at traditional approaches like inventory and second sourcing, which sound good in theory, but they fail. And so data, managing risk with knowledge of your supply chain, information about your suppliers, et cetera, having a supply chain mapping system, having a continuous centralized repository that is easily accessible to your experts is the key, and best-in-class companies have figured out this part very effectively. So I think more on that, as I said, our white paper will soon be available, so please check back and let us know if you're interested in receiving it, which will have more prescriptive ideas and suggestions on what you can do proactively. So with that, John, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bindia. We'll now address some questions that came in during the presentation. Bob, this question is for you. Assuming the best case, would not the increased defense expenditures also increase the possibility of later military action with no best option?
I think if you have additional military spending, it always makes you more capable, if I'm catching the thrust of your question right. The problem is that I don't know that you're ever going to have perfect confidence, for example, that you could take out all of the North Korean military infrastructure, launch infrastructure particularly. And nor can you ever probably have perfect confidence that your intelligence is perfect. And therefore, you may think you know where all their launch infrastructure is housed, but what if you're wrong? So you can spend more, it helps, but I don't know that it's ever going to be a perfect solution. Is that,
okay.
Just want to be sure I'm responsive to the question.
Yes, thank you. Bindia, this question is for you. With assembly and test in multiple countries outside South Korea, could you argue that memory is more critical and potentially more disruptive if Samsung and Hynix are impacted, given that they represent about 60% of the worldwide capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at company by company, but I would argue that if you look at, for sure, not disagreeing with what you said, but I'm saying there's a broader problem, which is, it's not just the stuff that you obviously know of based on, easily available data, because there are small standard components based in where the suppliers are based in Japan and South Korea that are not as important as memory and are not as obvious as memory, but we see that through our mapping data are equally a big problem. I mean, in 2000, we had tantalum capacitors, that had a 1-year lead time. So you understand that what I'm talking about are small things that are made in these countries that aren't the obvious things like memory, which absolutely is a huge issue in and of itself.
Okay, great point. My next question is, how do you think humanitarian and relief organizations will be impacted by these 6 scenarios?
Well, I guess I'll take that. I think that humanitarian, obviously the more devastation that occurs, the more work that needs to be done of a humanitarian nature. That's one. And 2, the more devastation that occurs, the tougher it is to use the infrastructure to do the humanitarian work, which is always a problem in humanitarian work. And so I think if you look at these scenarios and you sort of scale them according to the amount of damage that would be done, you start to get a sense of which creates more difficult humanitarian situations. And of course, each of these scenarios, like an attack on South Korea, could, as one of the slides said, be a border skirmish, or it could be an all-out attack. The humanitarian challenge, of course, is quite different depending on that. I think, the humanitarian effort with regard to South Korea and Japan, because they're connected to the outside world much more freely, it may be a little easier for humanitarian organizations to operate there. What would happen in North Korea, I don't have much insight into.
Okay. And Vindhya, in terms of best practices for communicating realistic expectations to executives who seem alarmed by media reports, what would be your advice for them? What would be some best practices that you could cite?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, the current rhetoric, the current uncertainty, boards and shareholders do not like it. Businesses don't like it. Stock market doesn't like it. So this is definitely a concern. And for supply chain executives, I think, create your playbooks, right? So if you haven't mapped your supply chain, invest in that, because mapping of your supply chain helps with not just this situation, but it helps you tell the story to your executives of what the risks are across many different types of risk scenarios. So having information proactively will help you inform and educate up your leadership chain and talk about the supply chain impact in an informed and in a well-informed way, being able to articulate how we did today. Look, here's where factories are located. This is how far they are from the border. This is where our parts are coming from. If there's an impact, this is how much of our revenue, these are the products that will be affected. Having these answers readily available for executives, quite frankly, it is job security in the future, because if you don't have these answers, quite frankly, I would say you're not doing your job, right? So know your supply chain, know who are the parties in your supply chain, talk to the suppliers based in China, ask them, to certify that they don't do business with North Korea. So these are the types of things that you are seeing based on what Bob talked about today. The types of scenarios that could happen, it translates. If you knew which of your suppliers have sites in China, you could create very, very quickly a quick code of conduct or a quick, principle representation for the supplier to make to you to certify that they are risk-free in this area. And then you go back to your executives and say, here's the actions we have taken, the diligence we have done. So I think it's good corporate governance, it is good practice, and it is important for executives to have that confidence in their people, that they've got this under control.
Thank you, Vindhya. And for any questions we were unable to address during the presentation, our presenters will reach out with answers to those questions. As we conclude today's event, thank you all for attending and for your interest and participation today. Please share your feedback on today's webinar through the survey we send out. We also appreciate your input about topics you'd like us to cover. If you're interested in other analyses, Resilinc has webinars and white papers on the recent hurricanes, which are available for download through their website. For guidance on how to plan and launch a proactive supply chain resiliency program, you can download the Ultimate Guide from Resilinc's website. It has step-by-step instructions, best practices, maturity models, tools, and the like to help you develop a business case and get organizational buy-in. Resilinc Advisory helps companies who are interested in getting expert help to help over a few months to do an initial assessment, gap analysis, and help develop the business case to get buy-in for the program roadmap and launch plan. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.